Okay, I'm gonna be explaining a timeline that I've been using for D&D and Pathfinder campaign. So if you wanna make your own kind of branch off of this story, feel free to, because it's starting to get kind of in depth. So, first off, I named my years LU. I don't yet know what that stands for. They're just two random letters associated with one another at this point. But I'm planning on figuring it out eventually. But anyways, in the year negative 2125, Samir rises as a god. Basically, Samir's whole thing is that he creates by destroying and destroys by creating. So, if he wants you dead, he'll create an item to destroy you, and then give it to someone who will use it to destroy you. If he wants to create something, he'll basically choose what to destroy in order for it to be created through natural processes, such as politics and genetics and various other processes. In the year 875, he made the Flute of Ocean's Destruction, which sends a lot of the sea creatures into a rage, and in a later year, much later, specifically year 1177, it was used by the Death Knights of the Apocalypse to send Leviathan into a rage. Later on, prior to 1177, but after the Flute of Ocean's Destruction was created, the Tablets of Destruction were also created in year 900. Basically, the Tablets of Destruction are 3 tablets which can be used together to spy on things going on, and they can cast a spell that generates a large eye in the sky kind of deal, which could technically be destroyed, but most people won't be able to do it before it goes off, and it's usually invisible. But when it's used offensively, it basically shoots a large beam down that turns a mile radius into a crater so deep that it penetrates through the crust. So it's just giant lava pool afterwards. It's supposed to be essentially this world's equivalent to the nuclear bomb. So, in the years 1175 to 1177, a book was held by the Death Knights of the Apocalypse. This is a little bit more complex to explain because I never actually gave the book a name, so it needs a name eventually, but for now I'll call it The Book. It was a book that has 4 gems associated with it, and essentially when the book and the gems are combined, it grants whoever has them great power. Kinda similar to the different tomes that once read increase your stats. But the difference is basically it gives godly powers, and using the book and the gems at the grave of a specific angel, I forgot his name, I'll have to check up on that to add it in. The monk Nomasco and a cleric, which was the other character in the campaign. We both, I believe, forgot the character's name before I started writing this, ended up raising to godhood. So later on I'll probably give the cleric a new name. But also, in the same year, Leviathan was killed by Nomasco and the cleric, who basically killed it after it went into a rage, after it helped them go down to fight the underwater Death Knight. Basically, he had an underwater base sort of thing. So, yeah. And the Death Knight used the Flute of Ocean's destruction to cause Leviathan to enter rage. After that, in year 1186, the Order of Leviathan and Nightwave were created. The Order of Leviathan and Nightwave are kinda a side effect of Leviathan's death. Basically, after Leviathan died, or rather before Leviathan died, he was essentially the strongest creature in the sea and a benevolent ruler of the ocean. So, there was an argument over who gets to rule over the sea after Leviathan. The Order of Leviathan basically ended up taking the soul of Leviathan and creating a copy of him, kind of. Except it wasn't really a copy, it was a mundane whale with Leviathan's soul, given more power than a mundane whale normally would have. And the Order of Nightwave ended up raising Leviathan from the dead as an undead servant. Basically, this is the same Nightwave as in the Pathfinder setting. Although, I'm sure they have completely different lore for Nightwave or whatnot. But yeah. So the Order of Nightwave ended up bringing Leviathan back as an undead servant. And their belief was that it was Leviathan's pure power that gave him control over the sea. And thus, the possessors of Nightwave's body should rule the sea, while the Order of Leviathan believed it was his noble soul that allowed him to rule the sea, and thus the possessor of his soul should rule the ocean. And thus they became fast enemies, and Leviathan and Nightwave repeatedly tried to kill each other. In 1493, the Arcane Archive was formed. Essentially, the Arcane Archive is a group of individuals who are working for arcane magic. A literal embodiment of arcane magic, which all the, sciences have their own embodiment. And they compete for who gets the future. So, arcane magic works with Arcane Archive to promote the discovering of magical items and magic spells. After that, in year 1501, the Council of Salem was formed. The Council of Salem are formed of a large number of identical witches, essentially clones of one single witch, who's quite powerful. He basically formed his own private army. Of course, they all have their own personality and their own soul. So, they got into debates at times. In year 1545, the Arcane Archive started gathering a lot of arcane items. Now, between 1545 and 1550, there's what's called the Hidden Time, in which Arcane's rival, psionics, basically used a huge psionic power to render 5 years completely hidden from the rest of the world. So, the group of adventurers in that time ended up walking out and finding it was winter 5 years later, all of a sudden. Also in the year 1550, the Council of Salem ended up capturing the Tarrasque, and notable, the adventurers at the time ended up collecting enough magical items, having traveled to the Hidden Time to uncover them, and defeating an Elder Brain. They discovered enough magical items to set destiny up so that eventually a magic-dominant age would come about, and thus they were transported to the future for that to happen. But in the meantime, in the year 1560, the Shelton family became royalty, specifically through marriage. In year 1569, the Merchandisers form. The Merchandisers are kind of an interesting group. They work with adventurers, and they record their memories, and then rent out those memories, so that people can view them. They are edited a bit before they are sold. Also note, the Merchandisers also sell merchandise and provide tools to their adventurers. So, they provide the items to them and then make like replicas and stuff to sell. And they pay the adventurers for that. Although they're kinda evil because they support both sides usually. So it's more of neutral, but they're evil in the way that they pay villains and provide villainous gear for them in order to be able to have their own villainous merchandise. In 1578, the Council of Salem discovers the Tablets of Destruction, which caused the War of Salem. And I should probably make a story of how they found the Tablets of Destruction, where they were all this time, but I haven't yet. But the Council of Salem were split on the issue of how to use the Tablets of Destruction. One side thought they should be used to eliminate evil. The other thought they should be guarded, but never used. That way, they aren't used and kill tons of people. And then after that, in 1580, Dominic Shelton becomes king. He is the first Shelton to the throne. The War of Salem lasts between 1578 and 1584. And basically, the War of Salem ended when some of the Salem members started mind controlling one another because they realized that their whole power is from their unity. So, in order to keep their power, they started mind controlling one another. Now, because there's so many of them, they had to capture an elder brain in order to process all these thoughts. In 1631, which is the year of a campaign I'm currently running, there's the Undead Rights Movement, which basically a lot of intelligent undead are really annoyed that they're able to be controlled and whatnot, and that it's not illegal to do so. And that, in general, undead are used as a major workforce. Later that year, the killing and arresting of undead protesters was sanctioned by the king's nephew, Edin Shelton. The current king is Vic Shelton. Later that year, almost in the same week, it was in the same week, actually. Some of the city-states to the east ended up breaking free from the western area. Essentially, those states became an undead kingdom. Now, the whole undead kingdom would have faced a lot of issues if the party didn't get the Council of Salem to back them up. Although, there is some kind of issues with them backing them up, because the Council of Salem is one of the groups that use the most undead, along with members of their own group being mind-controlled and whatnot. So, the adventurers of the group had to negotiate with the Undead Lord to basically convince him to give up or allow the Council of Salem to keep their undead in exchange for the Salem's backing. Now, this only ended up happening because they ended up getting from Nomasco a ring of diplomacy of such great degree that they simply enough could, with being polite, purely dominate the undead lord of these new broken city-states, or of the newly formed undead kingdom, I should say. And The note below that is just a reminder of the name of a vampire lord bartender named Chris Alamer. In 1884, the Council of Salem was captured. To put that in layman's terms, specifically, the Death Knights of the Apocalypse ended up mind controlling the Council of Salem, which is surprisingly easy to do because they're all already mind controlling one another. So if you get the person on top of that stack of mind control under control, you control all of them. And by the way, if you didn't guess, the Death Knights of the Apocalypse are a group of Death Knights, specifically 8 Death Knights, whose whole goal is to end the world. And they showed up once prior in history thus far, where they claimed the book and were trying to collect the gems, but they were stopped by Nomasco and the cleric. In 1887, the Adamantine Tower was sold and transformed into the Tower of Idiosyncrasies. This will require a little bit more explaining. In the year 1631, prior to the Undead Rights movement, the Adamantine Tower was made by Nomasco, which was then sold to the Party of Venturers. Also, the Adamantine Tower prior to that was a undead necromancer's tower, which was destroyed and then turned into a adamantine tower that was then sold for cheap to this Party of Venturers, which was then sold to the Death Knights of the to the Council of Salem, which was then captured by the Death Knights of the Apocalypse, which was then sold by them because they didn't really have a need for it, to the wizard Idiosyncrasies, which then made it into his own tower. The Tower of Idiosyncrasies is an interesting place because beyond its whole adamantine build-up and stuff, it also was made into a multi-dimensional structure, and this was in part by the god Cymere tearing holes in the area around it, destroying it in order to encourage Idiosyncrasies to use the place to make new species, because Idiosyncrasies needed chaos power to create his beings. And by the way, Idiosyncrasies is a wizard who alters creatures, combines them and takes them apart and several other things. But yeah, so he built the tower there because it was a good tower and because it had holes in reality dug around it so that it could be easily transformed into a multi-dimensional structure. So yeah, that tower has a complex backstory, probably more complex than most of my characters have. Okay, and then finally in 2554, the magic dominant age happens. And that was my D&D campaign timeline. Thank you very much.